The Arizona Territory in 1878 was a crucible, a place that burned away everything you were leaving, only what you needed to survive. For Katerina Barlow, a schoolteacher from Boston, it had burned away her savings, her optimism, and the last vestiges of her Eastern poise. It left her with dust in her throat, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. She thought she understood the harsh realities of this land, the rattlesnakes, the flash floods, the quiet desperation in the eyes of homesteaders. But she knew nothing. Not until the day the sun was blotted out by a figure in her doorway, a man larger than any she had ever seen, his skin the color of burnished copper, and his eyes as dark and ancient as the mesas. He was Apache, and he had come not for blood or gold, but for her. The one-room schoolhouse in Redemption Gulch was Katerina Barlow's entire world. By day, its rough-hewn wooden walls echoed with the stumbling recitations of farm children who smelled of soil and sweat. By night, it was her fortress against the vast, swallowing silence of the desert. The silence was the worst part. Back in Boston, there was always the rumble of a carriage, the chime of a distant clock, the murmur of voices through a wall. Here the silence was an active predator, punctuated only by the mournful cry of a coyote or the whisper of wind through the skeletal arms of a saguaro. At 26, Katerina was an anomaly. She possessed an education few women, and even fewer men, could claim in this unforgiving corner of the world. But that education was a poor shield against the realities of her life. She had fled a suffocating future in Boston, an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, with hands like damp spiders, only to find a different kind of cage. In Redemption Gulch, she was a curiosity, the spinster schoolmarm, respected for her letters, but pitied for her solitude. The town's most prominent rancher, Clayton Reed, had made his intentions clear. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mountains, with a possessive smile and an air of ownership that extended to everything he saw, including her. He spoke of building her a proper house, of giving her his name as if it were a crown. To the other women in town, it was a dream. To Katerina, it was simply a more spacious cage, with a prettier view. His courtship was a slow, tightening rope, and her polite refusals were becoming harder to sustain. On this particular Tuesday, the heat was a physical blow. The dozen or so students had been dismissed early, their energy sapped by the oppressive sun. Katerina sat at her small desk, a ledger of dwindling school supplies open before her. The ink in the well was nearly dry. The last of her salt pork was gone. She was rationing coffee beans. Her meager salary from the town council was 3 months overdue, a fact Sheriff Brody met with a shrug and a casual, "Times are tough, Miss Barlow." That's when the shadow fell over her doorway. It wasn't the slow-moving shade of a passing cloud. It was sudden, absolute, and chilling despite the heat. Katerina looked up her hand instinctively, going to the letter opener on her desk, a flimsy piece of silver that was her only weapon. The man standing there filled the entire frame. He was immense, not in girth but in sheer height and breadth of shoulder. His buckskin leggings were worn his torso bare, save for a simple leather vest that did little to hide the corded muscle of his arms and chest. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair, which fell unbound past his shoulders. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a mask of hard angles and weathered endurance, his nose hawkish, his jaw set like stone. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room, the children's clumsy drawings pinned to the wall, the worn copies of Shakespeare and Plato on her shelf, and finally her. He was Apache. Not a reservation, Apache broken and weary, but one from the high country, a ghost of the free tribes that still haunted the edges of the white man's world. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Katerina. She had heard the stories, the whispered fears of raids and scalpings. He took a step inside his moccasins, silent on the wooden floorboards. The scent of pine leather and something wild and elemental filled the small room. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his size. He stopped a few feet from her desk, his presence sucking the very air from the room. Her voice, when she found it, was a thin, reedy thing. "What do you want?" The giant Apache did not smile. His expression remained unreadable. He looked at her truly, looked at her with an intensity that stripped away her pretense of being the school marm and left her feeling like a small, frightened woman 1,000 miles from home. His gaze lingered on her fair hair, a stark contrast to his own, and the blue of her eyes. He spoke, and his voice was not the guttural grunt she might have expected from the town's racist caricatures. It was a deep, resonant baritone, his English precise, with only the faintest lilting accent. "You are the teacher," he stated. It wasn't a question. She could only nod her throat tight. He surveyed her again, his eyes taking in her worn but clean dress, the ink stains on her fingers, the determined set of her chin. "They say you are alone. You have no man, no family. My affairs are my own." She managed a spark of her Boston defiance, flickering to life. A flicker of something, perhaps respect. Perhaps amusement crossed his face. "I have watched you," he said, the admission sending a fresh wave of fear through her. "You walk alone. You buy food, for one. You read your books by the lamp long after the town is dark. You are strong, but you are not safe here. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself." She lied, her hand trembling around the letter opener. He ignored her protest. His gaze became heavier, more direct, as if he were weighing her soul. He took another step forward, and she flinched back in her chair. He stopped holding up a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture to hold his place. The silence stretched thick with unspoken meaning. Then he delivered the words that would shatter her world. He spoke with the simple, undeniable logic of a man who dealt in the currency of survival, not sentiment. "My people are dying," he said, his voice low and raw with a pain that transcended the space between them. "The white man's sickness has taken many. The blue coats take the rest. We need new blood. Strong blood." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, seeing not just a woman but a solution, a future. "I need a wife," he declared, the words hanging in the stifling air like a death sentence. "And you," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "you need strong sons to protect you in this land. It is a good trade." Katerina stared at him, the man's words echoing in the profound silence of the schoolhouse. A wife. Strong sons. A trade. The sheer audacity, the primal simplicity of the proposition left her breathless. It wasn't a courtship or a proposal, it was a statement of fact, a transaction laid bare on her dusty desk like a pelt to be bartered. Laughter, hysterical and sharp, bubbled up in her chest. It was the only response her shocked mind could produce. "A wife," she choked out the sound, thin and brittle. "You walk into my school and declare that you need a wife. Do you think I am livestock, a sack of flour to be claimed?" The Apache's expression didn't change. He possessed a stillness that was more unnerving than any overt aggression. He simply waited for her hysteria to pass his patience as vast and unyielding as the desert outside. "My name is Nash," he said, finally, his voice calm and even. "I am Nantan to the Chiricahua who follow me, a leader. I do not take what is not given. I am offering you a choice." "A choice," she repeated, her voice rising. The choice between a life with a stranger, a savage. She spat the word the town's ugly prejudice surfacing in her fear, or what you'll drag me from here by my hair. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was not anger, but a deep, weary sorrow. "The word is savage because you do not understand us," he said softly, "and I would not drag you. But you misunderstand your position, teacher. You think you are free. You are not." He gestured vaguely toward the town. "That man, the one with the big hat and the silver star, Sheriff Brody, he offers you no help when your pay is gone. The rancher Clayton Reed, he looks at you with hunger. He thinks he will own you. The women of the town, they smile at you, but they whisper behind their hands. You are a lone mare at the edge of a wolf pack, and you think your books will save you." Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow striking at the heart of her most private fears. He had seen it all: her precarious finances, Reed's predatory advances, her profound isolation. He had watched her, and he had understood in a way no one else had. The realization was terrifying. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I told you," Nash said, his voice losing its hard edge replaced by a raw urgency. "My people are few. The spotted sickness that came with the soldiers took my wife and my first son 3 winters ago. It has taken half our women and more of our children. We fight the Mexicans to the south, the soldiers from the forts, and now we fight ghosts in our own blood. The world is changing. Our sons must be able to walk in both worlds. They must have the strength of the Apache, but they must also understand the white man's ways. His words, his weapons." He looked at her, and for a moment, the giant warrior vanished, replaced by a man burdened by a terrible responsibility. "You have this knowledge," he said, nodding toward her books. "You have courage. Your children would be formidable. They would survive." The cold, pragmatic logic of it was chilling. He wasn't speaking of love or even affection. He was talking about genetics, about survival, about forging a new generation as a living weapon against extinction. "And what of me?" Katerina asked, her voice hollow. "What life would I have? You would be the Nantan's wife," he said, as if that explained everything. "You would be protected. You would never be hungry. You would be honored. No man, white or Apache, would dare to touch you. You would teach our children. Not just your own, but all of them. You would make us stronger." She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. "I can't. I was not raised for such a life. I know nothing of your ways." "You learn," he said simply, "as I learned your language, as I learned to read the marks in your books from a man I captured long ago. You are a teacher. It is your nature to learn." He saw the indecision warring in her eyes, the terror mixed with a flicker of something else. He pressed his advantage, his voice dropping lower. "Stay here, and in a month, maybe 2, your money will be gone. You will have a choice: marry the rancher who wishes to break you like a horse, or sell your body in the saloon. Or perhaps you will starve. That is the freedom your people offer you. I offer you a life. A hard life, yes, but a life of purpose. Your sons will be chieftains and warriors, not pale, coughing clerks in a dusty city." He was laying her future bare, and she couldn't deny the truth in his bleak assessment. Her pride, her education, her fierce independence, they were all luxuries she could no longer afford. She had come west to escape one cage, only to find the walls of another closing in. Nash was offering a third option. It was a leap into an abyss, a terrifying unknown. But it was a choice. If I were to consider this," She began the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "There would be conditions." Nash inclined his head. "Speak them." "I will not be a slave or a concubine. I will be your wife, and your only wife. I will be treated with respect." "It is our way," he confirmed. "The Nantan has one wife. My children will learn to read and write from my books, as well as learn your ways. That is why I have come for you." He nodded. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final, most important condition. "And you will never raise a hand to me in anger. Ever. I will not be beaten." The memory of her father's drunken rages, the reason she held men like Clayton Reed at arm's length, rose like bile in her throat. Nash's dark eyes studied her face, and he seemed to see the old fear, the hidden wounds behind her demand. A look of understanding so profound it startled her passed over his features. He stepped forward, and this time she did not flinch. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He slowly, deliberately reached out, not to grab her, but to gently take the silver letter opener from her trembling hand. He held it for a moment, then placed it carefully back on her desk. "An Apache warrior does not strike his woman," he said, his voice a low vow. "She is the heart of his home. To strike her is to strike himself. You have my word, Katerina Barlow. You will have my protection, my name, and my respect. But I will have your loyalty, and you will give me sons." He turned and walked to the doorway, his silhouette once again blocking the harsh afternoon light. "You have until the full moon," he said, not looking back. 3 nights. Be ready. I will come for you then." And then he was gone, leaving Katerina alone in the ringing silence, the dust motes dancing in the column of light where the giant had stood. She looked at her empty ledger at the door to her lonely room, and then at the vast, merciless expanse of the desert beyond. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid of the wilderness. She was afraid of the agonizing choice it had just offered her. The 3 days Katerina had were a blur of feverish anxiety. She slept little, the face of Nash haunting her waking thoughts and her dreams. She went through the motions of teaching her voice, distant as she listened to children recite multiplication tables, her mind 1,000 miles away in the rugged Dragoon Mountains. She knew he called home. Every time a shadow crossed the window, her heart leapt into her throat. Clayton Reed stopped by, tipping his hat, with that infuriatingly confident smile. "Evening, Miss Barlow," he'd said, his eyes roaming over her as if she were already his property. "Heard a rumor you had a visitor, an unwelcome one." News traveled fast in Redemption Gulch. "I'm quite all right, Mr. Reed," she'd replied, her voice cool. "Just remember, a lady like you needs protection out here." He'd pressed his hand, lingering on the doorframe. "My offer still stands." His words meant to be a comfort were the final push she needed. The choice was between a gilded cage and an unknown wilderness. She found herself packing. Not much, a few changes of her sturdiest clothes, her cherished copies of Shakespeare and Keats, and a small leather-bound journal. She was terrified, but beneath the terror was a sliver of something else, a wild, reckless sense of agency. For the first time, she was not just reacting to her fate, she was choosing it. On the night of the full moon, she sat in the darkened schoolhouse, a single bag at her feet, waiting. True to his word, he appeared not as a spectre, but as a solid presence, materializing from the gloom. He had 2 horses, wiry mustangs that were built for endurance, not for show. He said nothing, simply taking her bag and tying it expertly behind one of the saddles. He helped her mount, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they circled her waist to lift her. Their journey was silent and swift, a trek under the cold silver light of the moon. They moved through arroyos and canyons, Nash navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinct that felt supernatural. For him, this harsh landscape was not an enemy. It was home. When the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in strokes of orange and violet, they arrived at his camp. It was not the chaotic savage village of her imagination. Tucked into a hidden canyon, watered by a thin, clear stream, were a dozen or so wickiups domed huts made of branches and hides. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Women looked up from their work grinding corn or stretching hides, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Children stopped their play to stare openly at the white-faced, strangely dressed woman Nash had brought into their midst. An old woman with a face like a wrinkled map, her eyes sharp and intelligent, approached them. Nash spoke to her in the flowing musical Apache tongue. The woman who Nash introduced as Sonseare, his mother's sister, looked Katerina up and down, her gaze missing nothing. She grunted, said something to Nash, and then turned to Katerina and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "You are thin," she stated. "You must eat. Come." The first weeks were a trial by fire. The life was brutally hard, a constant cycle of work dictated by the sun and the seasons. Katerina, who had considered her life in Redemption Gulch to be one of hardship, quickly learned the meaning of true toil. She learned to grind mesquite beans into flour, to find water where there seemed to be none, to stitch buckskin with an awl and sinew, her soft hands quickly becoming calloused and raw. Her presence was a source of tension. A young brooding warrior named Dasoda, who Katerina learned was Nash's cousin, made his contempt clear. He would stare at her with open hostility, muttering to the other men in their own language. He saw her as a weakness, a symbol of the white world that had brought them nothing but misery and disease. He believed Nash's choice was a betrayal of their people and their traditions. Nash was a constant, steady presence, but a distant one. Theirs was not a marriage of affection. They slept in the same wickiup, but on separate bedrolls of buffalo hide. He was patient, answering her endless questions about his people's customs and beliefs, but he offered no personal intimacy. He was her protector and her provider, not her companion. He was waiting for her to prove herself to become one of them, not by declaration, but by deed. One evening, as Katerina was struggling to scrape a deer hide, the knife slipping in her clumsy grip, Sonseare came and sat beside her. She took the tool from Katerina's hand, and with a few deft, economical strokes, showed her the proper angle and pressure. "You think with your head," the old woman said, her voice raspy. "You must feel the work with your hands. The hide tells you what it needs." Katerina, frustrated and exhausted, felt tears welling in her eyes. "I am trying. It is just so different." Sonseare looked at her black eyes softening for a moment. "The Nantan chose you for your mind," she said, "but you cannot live in this world with your mind alone. Your heart must learn the rhythm of the mountain. Your hands must learn the song of the work. Be patient. The desert does not hurry." Slowly, painfully, Katerina began to adapt. She started a small school for the children, teaching them the English alphabet by scratching letters in the dirt with a stick. They were bright and eager, and in their faces she found a sense of purpose that had been missing even in her schoolhouse in Redemption Gulch. They in turn taught her. They showed her which berries were sweet and which were poison, how to read animal tracks in the dust, and how to sit in silence and simply listen to the world around her. Her relationship with Nash remained a careful dance of distance and respect. He would watch her with the children, a thoughtful, unreadable expression on his face. One night, He found her reading her Shakespeare by the firelight, her lips moving silently. He sat across from her, and after a long silence, he spoke. "Read to me," he said. Startled, she looked up. "What? The words in your book? Read them aloud." Hesitantly, she began to read from The Tempest, her voice gaining strength as she lost herself in the rhythm of the verse. She read of Prospero and Miranda, of spirits and shipwrecks, a world of magic and mystery, so far removed from their own. Nash listened intently, his eyes closed, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. When she finished the scene, he was silent for a long time. "Your world makes magic with words," he said finally, his voice soft. "My people find it in the wind and the stones." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Perhaps they are the same thing. It was the first crack in the wall between them, the first moment she felt they were not just two parties in a contract, but two people from different worlds trying to find a common language. She was still an outsider, and the alliance was still unsettling, but for the first time, huddled by a fire in a hidden Apache camp, Katerina Barlow felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a fragile, tentative sense of belonging. The news of Katerina Barlow's disappearance hit Redemption Gulch like a dust storm. At first it was simple concern. Then, when a stable boy mentioned seeing her ride out with the giant Apache, concern curdled into outrage. The narrative was written before the ink was even dry. The gentle school mom, a beacon of civilization, had been abducted by a savage brute. Clayton Reed was the one who fanned the flames. Her rejection of him had been a public humiliation, a wound to his considerable pride. This abduction was a personal affront. It was one thing to be turned down, it was another to be turned down for an Apache. In his mind, she had not made a choice. She had been stolen, and he, as the town's self-appointed patriarch, would be her rescuer. "He's taken her!" Reed bellowed in the center of the saloon, slamming his fist on the bar. "That red-skinned devil has taken Miss Barlow. Are we going to stand for it? Are we going to let our women be carried off like cattle?" His words found fertile ground in the fear and prejudice that ran deep in the town's veins. Men who had barely given Katerina a second glance were suddenly her sworn protectors. The Apache were a convenient scapegoat for every hardship they faced: drought, cattle disease, their own failed ventures. This was a chance to turn their simmering resentment into righteous action. Sheriff Brody, a man more concerned with maintaining a quiet life than dispensing true justice, found himself backed into a corner. He was a pragmatic man. He knew venturing into the dragoons after a Chiricahua war leader was tantamount to suicide. But the pressure fueled by Reed's money and influence was immense. "Now hold on, Clayton," Brody said, trying to inject a note of caution. "We don't know for a fact she was taken against her will." "Against her will?" Reed scoffed his face, turning a blotchy red. "She's a Lady Brody, a refined woman from back east. You think she chose to go live in a mud hut and eat snake? He's got her tied up somewhere scared out of her mind. It's our duty as white men to get her back." The rhetoric worked. A posse was formed within the hour. It was a motley collection of angry ranchers, bored farmhands, and drunken opportunists, all armed to the teeth and full of whiskey-fueled bravado. Clayton Reed, astride his magnificent black stallion, looked every bit the conquering hero, his silver-inlaid saddle glinting in the sun. Sheriff Brody, looking deeply uncomfortable, reluctantly pinned on a deputy badge for Reed and a half-dozen of his men. Their first stop was the deserted schoolhouse. Reed kicked open the door, his spurs gouging the wood. The room was just as Katerina had left it, save for a fine layer of dust. It was tidy, orderly. There were no signs of a struggle. "He must have surprised her," one of the men muttered. Reed strode over to her desk. He rifled through her papers, his crude hands smudging the neat ink of her lesson plans. He was looking for evidence for some confirmation of his narrative. He found her journal tucked beneath a stack of books. He flipped it open, his lips moving as he slowly read her elegant script. His face darkened. The last entries weren't about fear or struggle. They were observations about her students, frustrations with her finances, and a single chilling line written on the night of the full moon, "I have made my choice." Reed slammed the journal shut. This didn't fit. A woman choosing an Apache over him, it was unthinkable. It meant she wasn't a victim. She was a traitor to her race. The thought twisted his fury into something colder, something more venomous. "She writes that she was afraid." Reed lied, his voice ringing with false piety. Afraid for her life. The savage forced her. He held up the journal as if it were a holy relic. "We ride at dawn. We'll bring Miss Barlow back, and we'll string up the monster that took her." Sheriff Brody watched him, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He knew Reed was lying. He could see it in the man's eyes. But the momentum was unstoppable now. The fury of Redemption Gulch had been unleashed, and it was thundering toward Nash's hidden camp, a wave of self-righteous violence disguised as a rescue mission. Brody knew this wouldn't end with a simple homecoming. It would end in blood. Meanwhile, in the canyon, life continued its rhythm, oblivious to the coming storm. A scout, a young man named Goyakla, had been watching the town from a high ridge. He rode into camp late in the day, his horse lathered in sweat. He went straight to Nash, speaking in low, urgent tones. Nash listened, his face impassive, but a new hardness settled in his eyes. He found Katerina by the stream where she was helping Sonziare clean roots. "The town is coming," he said, his voice flat. Katerina looked up, her heart lurching. "Coming, why?" "They believe you are a prisoner," Nash explained. "The rancher Reed leads them. They come with many rifles." Sonziare spat on the ground. "They come to kill." Fear, cold and familiar, gripped Katerina. The world she had left behind was now coming to destroy the one she had just begun to build. She looked at the faces of the children who now followed her everywhere, at the women who were slowly beginning to accept her, at the ruggedly beautiful canyon that had become her home. "What will you do?" she asked Nash, her voice trembling. "We will not run," he said, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "This is our land. We will fight." Desoda and the other warriors were already gathering, checking their rifles, stringing their bows. Their faces were grim, their movements purposeful. There was no panic, only a deadly resolve. Desoda shot Katerina a look of pure loathing. "This is your fault," his eyes screamed. "You have brought death to us." Katerina felt a crushing weight of responsibility. Whether she was a victim or a willing participant didn't matter to the posse. Her presence here was the pretext, the excuse they needed. She looked at Nash, at the leader preparing to defend his people from a threat she had inadvertently brought upon them. The unsettling alliance they had forged was about to be tested by fire and gunpowder. The posse from Redemption Gulch moved with the clumsy arrogance of men who believed in the righteousness of their cause and the superiority of their weapons. They thundered through the lowlands, scaring up jackrabbits, and quail making enough noise to alert anyone within 5 miles. Clayton Reed rode at their head, his face a mask of grim determination. Sheriff Brody trailing behind him with a growing sense of dread. Nash did not choose to meet them on open ground. He was a master of this terrain, and he used it. He led his handful of warriors into the narrow, rock-strewn approach to the canyon, setting up an ambush that was both elegant and deadly. They were ghosts among the boulders, invisible, silent. The posse rode directly into the trap. The first sign of trouble was an arrow appearing, as if from nowhere, thudding into the pommel of Clayton Reed's saddle. His horse reared, screaming. Before the men could even raise their rifles, a volley of gunfire erupted from the rocks above them. It was not a wild spray of bullets, but precise, targeted shots. One man clutched his shoulder. Another's hat was shot clean off his head. Panic erupted. "They're up there!" someone yelled. "In the rocks!" Men scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the canyon walls. Their bullets whined and ricocheted, wasted on stone. Nash's voice boomed from the heights, amplified by the canyon's acoustics. "Turn back, white men. The woman is not your concern." "The hell she isn't!" Reed roared back, his face purple with rage. He fired his pistol wildly at the unseen enemy. "Give us Miss Barlow, you heathen, or we'll burn you out." From his perch, Nash watched the chaos below. He could have ended it then and there. His warriors were in perfect position. They could have picked off the posse one by one. But he knew that a massacre would only bring the U.S. cavalry, and that was a war he could not win. He was fighting for survival, not for vengeance. This had to end another way. He gave a sharp command in Apache. The gunfire from his men ceased. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the battle. "Send your sheriff forward," Nash called out. "Alone, or the next shots will find flesh." There was a frantic, muttered conversation below. Sheriff Brody, looking pale but resolute, holstered his pistol and urged his horse forward into the open. He stopped in the middle of the canyon floor, a solitary figure under the immense, indifferent sky. "Nash!" Brody yelled, his voice strained. "We just want the teacher. Let her go, and we'll leave in peace." This was the moment, the pivot upon which everything would turn. Back in the camp, Katerina had listened to the distant sounds of the battle with a heart full of terror. Sonsiare and the other women had gathered the children, their faces stoic, but their eyes wide with fear. Dasoda had been among the fighters, and Katerina knew he would blame her for any blood that was shed. She couldn't stay hidden. This was her battle, too. Ignoring Sonsiare's sharp command to stay put, Katerina scrambled up a narrow path that led to a ledge overlooking the canyon entrance. She arrived breathless just as Nash was about to answer the sheriff. He turned his eyes widening in surprise and anger as he saw her. "Go back," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is about me. Let me speak." He studied her for a long moment, seeing not a frightened woman, but a determined one. He gave a curt nod. Katerina stepped to the edge of the ledge, her simple buckskin dress a stark contrast to the lace and corsets of her past. Down below, the men of the posse looked up. A collective gasp went through them as they saw her alive and unharmed, standing beside the giant Apache. "Miss Barlow," Sheriff Brody called out, relief washing over his face. "Are you all right? He hasn't hurt you." Clayton Reed pushed his horse forward, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "Katerina, thank God, we've come to save you." Katerina took a deep breath, the dry desert air burning her lungs. This was it. The choice. She could run to them, back to the safety of Redemption Gulch, back to the cage she knew. Or she could stand her ground here on this rock and claim the terrifying, uncertain freedom she had chosen. "I am not a prisoner, Sheriff Brody," she called down, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the canyon. "I am here by my own choice." The words fell like stones into the silence. The men of the posse stared slack-jawed. Sheriff Brody looked utterly bewildered. Clayton Reed's face twisted from concern to disbelief, and then to pure, unadulterated fury. "Choice!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "They've twisted your mind, Katerina. That's not you talking, that's fear." "I have never been less afraid in my life, Clayton," she replied, her gaze locking with his. The lie was so profound, so complete that it became its own kind of truth in that moment. Nash has treated me with honor and respect, more than I can say for some men in Redemption Gulch. The barb hit its mark. Reed flinched as if struck. "She's a traitor," one of Reed's men yelled. "A race traitor." The sentiment rippled through the posse. Their righteous rescue mission had just been exposed as an unwanted intrusion. Their damsel was not in distress. Sheriff Brody held up a hand. He looked from Katerina standing proud and defiant on the ledge to Reed, his face contorted with hate. The sheriff was not a brave man, but he was not a fool either. He could see the truth. "The lady has made her choice," Brody announced, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. "There's nothing for us here. We're leaving." "Like hell we are," Reed snarled, drawing his pistol. "She belongs with her own kind." He aimed the pistol, not at Nash, but at Katerina. It was an act of pure spite. If he couldn't have her, no one would. Before he could fire, an arrow flew from the rocks with breathtaking speed. It struck Reed in the forearm, causing him to scream in pain and drop the gun. It was a crippling shot, not a killing one. It was a message. Nash stepped forward beside Katerina, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was an image of absolute power and restraint. "The next arrow will be in your throat," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Leave. Now." Sheriff Brody didn't need to be told twice. He and the more sensible men of the posse began to back away, turning their horses. Reed, clutching his arm and spewing curses, was forced to follow, his eyes still fixed on Katerina with a look of murderous hatred. As the posse retreated in disarray, Katerina stood on the ledge, the adrenaline slowly seeping from her body, leaving her trembling. She had done it. She had publicly severed her ties to her old world. She had chosen a side. She turned to Nash. He was looking at her, his dark eyes no longer unreadable. In their depths, she saw something new, something she hadn't seen before. It was not just respect for her courage. It was a dawning wonder, a grudging admiration that went beyond the terms of their original bargain. In the dust and the blood and the echo of gunfire, their contract had been irrevocably broken. And in its place, something far more complicated and far more dangerous had just begun to grow. The aftermath of the standoff settled over the camp like a quiet snowfall. The immediate threat was gone, but the air was thick with unspoken changes. Katerina's public declaration had altered everything. She was no longer just the white woman Nash had brought home. She was the woman who had stood with them, who had turned her back on her own people for theirs. For some like Sonseere, it earned a new level of deep, quiet respect. For others like Dasoda, it only deepened their suspicion. A dog that turns on its first master, his glare seemed to say, cannot be trusted with a new one. But the most profound shift was between Katerina and Nash. The rigid formal distance they had maintained began to dissolve, eroded by the shared danger. They were no longer just partners in a contract of survival. They were allies who had faced death together. One evening, a few days after the posse's retreat, Nash returned from a hunt with a deep gash on his leg from a cornered javelina. He limped into the wickiup and sat heavily, his face stoic, as he prepared to tend to the wound himself with a heated knife and some herbs. Katerina, seeing this wordlessly, took the supplies from him. She knelt before him, cleaning the wound with a gentleness his warrior's life had rarely afforded him. He watched her, his body tense at first, then slowly relaxing under her careful touch. Her hands, though calloused now, were still the hands of an educated woman, precise and steady. "In my world," she said softly, not looking up from her work, "a man would be howling and crying for a doctor." A low rumble like stones shifting deep underground came from his chest. It was a moment before she realized he was chuckling. The sound was so unexpected, it made her pause. "An Apache warrior does not cry out," he said, his voice laced with a faint amusement. "It invites the spirits of the wound to linger." "A fascinating theory," she murmured, concentrating on stitching the gash with a fine needle and sinew. "I prefer the theory that it simply alerts predators to your weakness." He was silent for a moment. "That too," he admitted. When she was finished her work neat and clean, she looked up at him. Their faces were only inches apart. The air in the small wickiup grew thick, charged with a sudden, palpable energy. She saw the lines of pain and exhaustion around his eyes, but she also saw the man behind the nantan, the man who carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. He saw not just the teacher or the white woman, but the fierce, courageous person who had stood on that ledge. He reached out his hand, gently touching her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of discovery of tenderness. It was more intimate than any kiss. "You have the heart of a warrior, Katerina Barlow," he whispered. The use of her full name, the softness in his voice, undid her. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. He caught it with his thumb. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "On the ledge. You could have gone with them. Back to your life." "I told you," she whispered back. "I made a choice." "Why?" he pressed. "It was not the life you were born to." She looked away toward the flickering fire. "The life I was born to was a cage. A comfortable one, perhaps, but still a cage. I think I would rather be free and terrified than safe and suffocated." She met his gaze again. "And my place is here now, with the children. With you." The admission hung in the air between them. That night, when they lay on their separate bedrolls, the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a breath held in anticipation. This burgeoning closeness did not go unnoticed. Dasoda watched them with growing fury. He saw Nash's softening gaze, the way Katerina now moved about the camp with a new confidence. He saw it all as a poison seeping into the heart of their people. She was making their leader weak, filling his head with white ideas. He decided to force the issue. A few days later, while Nash was away tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on their goat herd, Dasoda confronted Katerina. He strode up to her, where she was teaching a group of children, his face a thundercloud. "This is not your place," he snarled in English for all to hear. He grabbed one of her books and threw it into the fire. The children scattered, terrified. Katerina stood her ground, her heart pounding. "They deserve to learn. They deserve to learn our ways," he spat. "How to hunt, how to fight, how to survive. Not this chicken scratch from your dying world." He took a menacing step toward her. "Nantan is blind. He sees a future in you, but I see an end. You are a disease, a white sickness, just like the one that took his first wife." The cruelty of the remark was a physical blow, but before Katerina could respond, Sonsi Array was there stepping between them. The old woman was half Dasoda's size, but she faced him with the fury of a cornered badger. She unleashed a torrent of Apache at him, her voice sharp and commanding. He argued back, but her words seemed to strike at his pride, at his honor. The other women of the camp began to gather their expressions hard, their loyalty clearly with the old woman. Dasoda outmaneuvered and shamed before the women finally backed down, spitting on the ground near Katerina's feet before storming away. Sonsi Array turned to Katerina, her face grim. "He will not challenge Nantan with fists," she said. "His poison is in his words. He will try to turn the other warriors against him. He believes Nash's heart has made him weak. He will try to prove it. When Nash returned, he saw the burned book and the tension in the camp. Katerina told him everything. The rage that entered his eyes was terrifying to behold. It was cold and absolute. He found Dasoda, and the confrontation was immediate, a low, guttural exchange in their own tongue. It was not a fight, but a judgment. Dasoda was not exiled. Their numbers were too few to lose a warrior, but he was stripped of certain honors, publicly rebuked by his leader. The humiliation solidified Dasoda's hatred into a deadly patient thing. He would wait for his moment. Later that night, the air in the wickiup was heavy. Nash came and sat beside Katerina's bedroll. "He will not harm you again," Nash said, the vow absolute. "You are Sheikah's my friend, my wife." He stumbled over the word as if testing its new meaning. He did not move back to his own bedroll. Instead, he lay down beside her, his large frame a warm, solid presence in the darkness. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a statement. The wall between them was finally gone. In the quiet darkness of the canyon, surrounded by whispers of love and simmering hate, Katerina Barlow knew her life was now inextricably bound to the giant Apache. Their bargain of convenience had blossomed into a fragile, dangerous affair of the heart, and the price of that love was yet to be paid. The peace in the canyon was a fragile skin stretched over simmering hatred. In redemption, Gulch, Clayton Reed's wounded pride, festered into a dark obsession. He would not be denied his vengeance. His poison found a willing vessel in Dasoda, whose heart was a cold stone of ambition and resentment. An alliance was forged in shadow, a treacherous pact to destroy Nash from within. Their plan was not a warrior's fight, but a coward's strike on a moonless night. Dasoda would guide Reed and a few hired guns to the camp's spring, its very lifeblood, and poison it. The attack came when the sky was a black, starless void. The only warning was the strangled bark of a camp dog cut brutally short. Nash was awake in an instant, moving from sleep to lethal readiness. He slipped out of their wickiup, and Katerina's heart hammered against her ribs. A moment later, a single muffled shot echoed from the direction of the spring. Nash was back in a breath, his face a grim mask. "Reed," he said the name a curse. "Dasoda has betrayed us. They are at the spring." The warriors armed themselves in deadly silence, but Katerina knew this was not a fight that could be won by arrows and rifles alone. An attack on the water was an attack on the children, the future. While Nash moved to intercept the men at the spring, her mind, the asset he had first sought, raced. Reed's hatred was personal. He would come for her. Spotting the old dry wickiups used for storage on the far side of the camp, she seized a torch. An idea desperate and brilliant took hold. She ran to Sonsiare. "A diversion," she cried, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Burn the old huts. Make them think the camp is in chaos, that we're escaping up the far canyon wall." The old woman understood immediately and began rallying the others. But Katerina's gamble was not yet complete. She would not be a refugee. She would be the bait. With another torch, she scrambled up a high, narrow ledge, overlooking the path to the spring, a dead end. There she lit a small, visible fire, a beacon for a hateful man. The ruse worked perfectly. Seeing flames erupt, Reed believed the Apache were in a panicked flight. Leaving 2 men to finish poisoning the water, he turned with a triumphant sneer. "She's mine," he snarled, spotting Katerina's lone fire. He and his last gunman scrambled up the rocks toward her. He found her, trapped, her face illuminated by the torchlight. "It's over, Katerina," he sneered, raising his pistol. "You chose the wrong side." "No," a voice growled from the darkness behind him. "She did not." Reed spun his face a mask of terror as Nash emerged from the shadows. The confrontation was not a gunfight. It was a primal collision. Reed, fueled by spite, was no match for a man fighting for his world. The struggle was short-ending with the flash of Nash's knife. As Reed fell, his gunman swung his rifle toward Nash, but before he could fire, an arrow appeared in his chest, sprouting from the darkness. Katerina looked down from the ledge and saw Dasoda below his bow still raised. He had led the enemy in, but he could not watch them slaughter his kin. He looked up at Katerina, his face a torment of shame and grim resolution. He gave her a single sharp nod, an admission, an apology, a farewell, before melting back into the night, an exile by his own hand. The rising sun illuminated a quiet final victory. The water was safe. The threat was gone. Katerina stood with Nash on the ledge, the canyon that was now their home spread below. He came to her, his hands gently framing her face. All pretense, all bargains were gone, burned away by the night's violence. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Your mind, your warrior's heart. You are the heart of this people, Katerina." He leaned down and kissed her a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a bond forged in blood and fire. It was a promise of a new future, a life woven from two starkly different worlds. Months later, holding their newborn son, a child with his father's dark, watchful eyes and her own fierce spirit, Katerina knew their trade had been more than good. She had come to the desert, a lonely teacher, running from a cage, only to find her true, untamable freedom in the arms of an Apache chief and in the cry of their strong son, the first of a new people. The story of Katerina Barlow and the Apache leader Nash is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a testament to the raw, untamable power of the human spirit to adapt to survive and to find love in the most unexpected corners of the world. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. Theirs was a union born not of convenience, but of a shared will to forge a future against impossible odds, proving that sometimes the most enduring bonds are the ones that challenge every convention we know. What lines are you willing to cross for survival, for love? If this story of grit, passion, and the clash of cultures resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who appreciates a story that goes beyond the simple tales of cowboys and Indians. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more lost tales and hidden histories from the forgotten West to share with you. Thank you for listening.